The land along the Patapsco River did not announce itself. It lay without grandeur, without markers, without any sign that history would later bend toward it. The water moved at its own pace, brown and steady, carrying silt from upstream and sound only when stones broke the surface. In the early morning the river held a low mist, thin enough to see through, thick enough to dull distance. On either side the ground rose gently into fields that had been worked too long by too many hands. The farms of Baltimore County in the first half of the 18th century followed no single pattern, but they shared the same burdens. Tobacco had stripped the soil. Seasons came late or early without apology. The work began before light and ended when the body failed rather than the task. There were no fences strong enough to hold order and no laws strong enough to soften cruelty. The land took what it was given and gave little back. On one such tract, roughly 100 acres, stood a small farm known by a plain name that carried no honor. The house was timber squared by hand, roofed in wooden shingles already darkened by years of rain. Smoke stained the chimney stones. Inside, the rooms were narrow, their floors worn smooth by the passing of feet that never rested long. Nothing about the place suggested distinction. It was neither poorer nor richer than others nearby. It existed to endure. Benjamin Banneker was born there in the late autumn of the year 1731. The season had already turned. The leaves were gone from the trees, and the ground had hardened at night. There is no record of the weather that day, only that he survived the first hours, which for many children born under similar circumstances was not assured. He was born free, a fact that set him apart before he ever drew breath, though he could not yet know the cost or weight of that condition. Freedom in Maryland did not mean safety. It did not mean acceptance. It meant only that the law did not claim the body outright. Everything else remained uncertain. A free black child grew beneath laws written to restrict him, watched by neighbors who measured worth by color, surrounded by a system that did not recognize exception. Benjamin's parents did not speak often of such matters when he was young. Survival required attention to immediate tasks. The farm demanded labor without pause. Fields had to be cleared, planted, cut, and burned back again. Tools broke and were mended. Livestock sickened and died. Weather erased work without warning. There was no margin for reflection during daylight hours. The rhythm of the days followed the land. At first light, work began. In summer, the sun rose early and lingered. In winter, daylight shortened, but labor did not. Cold settled into hands and joints. Meals were simple, eaten when time allowed rather than when hunger demanded. Silence filled the spaces where speech would have cost energy better spent elsewhere. Benjamin learned this rhythm as he learned to walk. He carried water, gathered wood, watched animals, and followed instructions without question. His body grew used to fatigue. His hands grew rough early. There was nothing unusual in this. Every child on neighboring farms learned the same lessons, though not every child learned them under the same conditions. The fields around the Banneker farm were worked by enslaved Africans owned by others. Their presence was constant. Their voices carried across property lines. Their movements marked the seasons more clearly than any calendar. Chains were not always visible, but their sound traveled far. Benjamin saw men and women laboring under watch, saw children driven into work before their strength had grown. He learned early what freedom was by observing what it was not. No one explained these distinctions to him directly. They did not need to. The laws of the colony made them plain. The patrols that passed on the road made them plain. The tone used when white men spoke to black men made them plain. The difference lay not in language but in posture, in who stood and who waited. The household that raised Benjamin was shaped by an unusual history, though it did not announce itself openly. His grandmother, Molly Welsh, lived on the farm for much of his early life. She had arrived in the colony long before his birth, bound by contract rather than chains, but bound nonetheless. Her labor had purchased the land that sustained the family. Her choices had shaped its legal standing. She did not speak often of her own past. When she did, it was without ornament. England was mentioned only as a place of departure, not of memory. The years of servitude were described in practical terms: work performed, rations received, debts settled. She spoke as one who had learned that recounting injustice did not undo it. What she did speak of, with care and insistence, was reading. The Bible sat on a shelf in the main room, its pages worn, its cover mended more than once. It was not treated as a relic. It was a tool. Molly had learned her letters under circumstances that discouraged learning, and she did not treat that knowledge lightly. When Benjamin was old enough to sit without restlessness, she began to teach him. The lessons did not follow any formal order. Letters were named as they appeared. Words were sounded out slowly. Meaning came later. There was no hurry. No one else on nearby farms taught children of color to read. Many considered it dangerous. Molly did not argue with those opinions. She simply ignored them. Benjamin listened closely. He repeated what he was told. He learned to recognize patterns before he understood purpose. Reading was not presented to him as a privilege or a rebellion. It was presented as something necessary, like counting seed or measuring cloth. Knowledge, in Molly's hands, was not abstract. It was a means of endurance. Outside the house, the world offered little encouragement for such learning. Books were scarce. Newspapers arrived irregularly. Almanacs passed from hand to hand until they fell apart. When printed material appeared, Benjamin examined it carefully, even before he could fully understand it. He traced letters with his finger. He memorized passages without knowing why. Work remained the central fact of his days. Learning took place at the edges, in moments stolen from fatigue. At night, by candlelight that could not be wasted, he read aloud until his voice failed. The words did not always make sense. He read them anyway. The land itself taught him other lessons. Weather did not behave predictably. Storms came out of season. Frost arrived early or late. Crops failed without explanation. Benjamin watched the sky more closely than others his age. He noticed patterns that did not announce themselves: the angle of light, the movement of clouds, the timing of birds. He did not speak of these observations. He stored them. There was little conversation on the farm beyond what was necessary. Silence was not enforced. It was habitual. When neighbors visited, they spoke of prices, of yields, of illness. News traveled slowly and often arrived distorted. Distant wars and distant laws mattered less than immediate survival. The talk ended when the work resumed. Benjamin grew into this environment without protest. He did not distinguish himself by disobedience or ambition. He worked as expected. He spoke when spoken to. He listened more than he talked. Nothing about his early years suggested what would later draw attention. Yet even in routine, difference appeared. When tasks were finished, he did not rest as others did. He lingered over tools, examining how they fit together. He counted without being asked. He measured distances with his steps. He watched the movement of shadows across the yard and marked their change. These behaviors were not praised. They were not punished either. They were simply noted and then forgotten, as most things were. There was no language for talent, no framework for exception. In a world built on rigid division, noticing difference required effort few were willing to make. As he grew older, responsibility increased. He took on heavier work. He managed tasks without supervision. The farm relied on his steadiness. He did not complain. He did not ask for more than was given. The land demanded constancy, and he gave it. The presence of injustice did not arrive as an event. It was ambient. It filled the air like smoke from distant burning. Laws existed that could at any time be turned against him. Neighbors could change without warning. Protection was conditional and fragile. Benjamin learned caution not as fear but as habit. He observed how authority functioned, who spoke with confidence, who was ignored, who was believed. He learned that proof did not always matter, that truth required endorsement to be accepted. These lessons were not taught formally. They were absorbed through repetition. The farm remained his world. Beyond it lay roads he rarely traveled and towns he knew only by name. His life narrowed not by choice but by design, yet within that narrowness his attention widened. At night, when the sky cleared, he stood outside longer than others. He did not yet name the stars. He did not yet calculate their movement. He simply watched. The constancy of their return offered something the land did not. They followed rules that did not shift according to power. This observation did not bring comfort. It brought focus. Benjamin did not imagine escape. He did not imagine recognition. Such ideas had no place in his daily life. He imagined understanding, how things worked, why patterns repeated, why some things could be predicted while others could not. These questions did not disturb his labor. They ran alongside it, quiet and persistent. Years passed without record. There are no accounts of his childhood beyond fragments preserved later. What remains is the setting itself. A free black boy growing up in a slave-holding society, taught to read by a grandmother who had survived her own form of bondage, working land that offered no mercy, watching a world structured to deny his worth without ever stating it aloud. Nothing yet had been crossed, nothing yet had been challenged. Life continued in its narrow channel, bounded by routine, silence, and the unspoken weight of power. This was the beginning. The first signs of injustice did not arrive as violence. They arrived as correction. Benjamin was still young when he learned that curiosity carried risk. Questions asked too openly invited suspicion. Silence, once merely a habit, became a form of protection. The farm existed within sight of other farms, and beyond those farms lay the structures of authority that governed daily life without always appearing. Magistrates, patrols, and landowners moved through the county with quiet confidence. Their presence was felt more often than seen. Benjamin's freedom depended on records kept elsewhere. Paper carried weight greater than flesh. A mistake, a dispute, or a false claim could undo a life. This was understood without instruction. Free black families learned to keep close to their land, to avoid conflict, to appear unremarkable. Distinction invited scrutiny, and scrutiny rarely favored them. As Benjamin grew into adolescence, he began traveling slightly farther from the farm. Supplies required trips to nearby settlements. These journeys exposed him to the structure of the county in ways that work alone had not. Markets brought together free men, enslaved men, and those who claimed ownership over both land and labor. The boundaries between these groups were enforced through tone and posture rather than open declaration. Benjamin observed these interactions carefully. He noticed who spoke first and who waited. He noticed how disputes were settled before they were fully heard. He noticed how the word of a white man carried authority even when contradicted by evidence. These observations did not shock him. They confirmed what the land had already taught. One incident remained with him longer than others. It was unremarkable to anyone else. A neighbor accused an enslaved man of taking food from a shed. The accusation rested on nothing more than absence and assumption. No one asked whether the man had been hungry. No one asked whether food had truly been taken. The punishment followed immediately. Benjamin did not see the act itself, only its aftermath. He saw the man return to the field slower than before, his posture altered, his movements careful. No one spoke of it again. That silence weighed on Benjamin. It was not the cruelty itself that lingered, but the ease with which it passed unchallenged. The system did not require justification. It required only compliance. On the Banneker farm, matters were quieter but not untouched by this structure. Neighbors visited with caution. Some treated the family with courtesy, others with indifference masked as politeness. Few spoke plainly. The laws against interracial marriage still existed, even if enforcement varied. The family's legal standing depended on continued restraint. Benjamin learned to measure speech. He learned which questions could be asked and which could not. When he spoke of reading or calculation, responses shifted. Interest hardened into unease. Praise, when offered, carried a note of warning. He was advised to focus on practical matters. Learning beyond necessity was described as indulgence. One visitor, a white farmer from a neighboring tract, examined a book Benjamin was reading and asked where he had learned his letters. The question was not hostile, but it was not neutral. Benjamin answered plainly. The man nodded once and returned the book without comment. After that visit, the boundary between farms seemed narrower. Such moments accumulated. They did not escalate, they pressed inward. Benjamin continued his routines. He worked the fields, maintained tools, and assisted where needed. He read when he could. He copied passages onto scraps of paper to preserve them. Writing materials were scarce. Ink was mixed carefully. Paper was reused until it failed. Each mark carried intention. At times, neighbors asked for assistance with simple calculations or measurements. Benjamin provided help without display. He did not explain his methods. He gave answers and returned to his work. This caution was learned, not taught. It arose from understanding that demonstration invited challenge. The injustice lay not only in punishment but in limitation. Opportunity narrowed without formal decree. Paths closed without announcement. Benjamin was not barred from learning by law, but he was discouraged by circumstance. Books were withheld. Instruction was unavailable. Advancement required permission that would not be granted. One afternoon, while assisting with a boundary dispute between two landowners, Benjamin provided measurements that contradicted the expectation of one party. His figures were accurate. They were also unwelcome. The matter was settled in favor of the man whose claim aligned with status rather than evidence. Benjamin was thanked and dismissed. No one questioned the outcome. That evening he returned home with a clearer understanding of how truth functioned within the county. Accuracy did not guarantee acceptance. Knowledge did not confer authority. These realizations did not embitter him. They instructed him. He began to keep his observations private. Calculations were done for his own understanding rather than for others. He recorded patterns without sharing conclusions. The world had shown him that exposure carried cost. The farm remained a place of relative safety, but even there, vigilance was required. Patrols passed along the road at irregular intervals. Their purpose was known. They did not stop at the Banneker farm often, but their presence reminded all who watched that freedom was conditional. Benjamin did not speak of fear. He did not frame his life in terms of injustice. Such language belonged to later reflection. At the time, he experienced only constraint, pressing gently but constantly against his movement. The signs were quiet. They did not announce themselves as wrong. They were simply the way things were. This understanding settled into him alongside his growing curiosity. It shaped how he learned, how he watched, how he waited. The world had begun to reveal its limits. Time did not soften the limits that had revealed themselves. It narrowed them. As Benjamin moved into full adulthood, the county changed in ways that did not announce improvement. Tobacco exhausted more land. Debts accumulated. Ownership consolidated. Those with authority sought greater control, not less, and control expressed itself through rules that multiplied quietly. New regulations appeared without ceremony. Patrols became more frequent. Papers were demanded more often and questioned more closely. Freedom, already fragile, required constant verification. Benjamin carried proof of his status whenever he traveled. The document was folded carefully and kept dry. He knew how easily such papers could be challenged, dismissed, or destroyed. He knew men who had been detained for lacking them, even when their freedom was known to neighbors. The law did not protect memory. It protected only what could be shown. The pressure was not personal, yet it pressed on him personally. Free black families across the county felt it in the tightening of movement and the narrowing of trust. A journey that once required explanation now required permission. Assistance once given casually was now withheld or questioned. Benjamin's learning continued, but the conditions around it grew less forgiving. Books were harder to borrow. Conversations that once lingered ended quickly. Curiosity, when noticed, was treated with suspicion. Knowledge carried implications that made others uneasy. He learned this most clearly when a visiting tradesman passed through with a small mechanical device. It was nothing elaborate, but it drew Benjamin's attention. He asked careful questions. He examined it closely. The tradesman answered at first, then grew reserved. The exchange ended sooner than expected. Later, Benjamin understood why. Skill implied independence. Understanding implied autonomy. In a society structured around hierarchy, such implications were not neutral. The farm itself became a site of increasing pressure. Taxes rose. Boundaries were re-examined. Neighbors who once kept distance now intruded with questions thinly disguised as concern. The land, once purchased through endurance, required continual defense. Benjamin assumed more responsibility as older family members weakened. Decisions that had once been shared fell to him alone. He managed accounts. He negotiated prices. He measured yields against need. These tasks sharpened his precision and reinforced his understanding of how easily imbalance could become loss. The injustice he observed was no longer limited to others. It brushed against his own stability. A single dispute, a single accusation, could unravel decades of careful living. This awareness did not lead him outward, it drove him inward. He worked longer hours. He reduced travel. He kept his pursuits quiet. The night became his refuge. When the fields rested, his attention shifted. He measured time by observation. He marked changes without recording them openly. He tested ideas against the sky rather than against opinion. Pressure built not through overt cruelty but through constant reminder of vulnerability. Authority did not need to strike. It only needed to remain present. Benjamin did not resist, he adapted. Yet adaptation carried cost. Each concession narrowed possibility. Each silence deepened isolation. He felt the weight of restraint even as he accepted it. The world allowed him to exist but not to expand. This tension settled into his daily life. It shaped how he worked, how he learned, how he imagined what might be possible. The pressure did not break him. It compressed him, forcing his attention into narrower channels where it intensified rather than dissipated. Something was forming, though he did not yet know its shape. The moment did not arrive with witnesses. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, and without any sense that it would later be described as decisive. At the time, it appeared no different from many other encounters that passed through Benjamin's life and left little mark. A traveling merchant came through the county late in the season, when roads were still passable but daylight had shortened. Such men arrived irregularly, carrying goods that could not be produced locally. Their visits were tolerated rather than welcomed. They brought novelty, but novelty often carried cost. The merchant stopped at several farms along the road, including Benjamin. He sought food, rest, and the possibility of trade. Benjamin's family offered what they could without generosity or refusal. Transactions were brief. The merchant's presence was temporary by design. Among the items he carried was a small timepiece. It was kept wrapped and handled carefully. Its presence drew attention not because it was rare, but because it was precise. Few objects in the county demonstrated such regularity. Time was usually measured by sun and shadow, by habit rather than mechanism. Benjamin noticed the watch immediately. He did not ask to see it at first. He waited. The merchant, accustomed to curiosity, eventually produced it. He held it out not as an invitation but as a demonstration. The ticking was steady. The movement was enclosed. The face marked hours with clarity. Benjamin asked if he might examine it more closely. The merchant hesitated, then agreed. He placed the watch in Benjamin's hands with instruction rather than trust. Benjamin accepted it carefully. He did not turn it immediately. He listened first. What followed was not impulsive. It was deliberate. Benjamin studied the weight, the balance, the sound. He asked questions that surprised the merchant. not because they were advanced but because they were precise. The merchant answered what he could, then grew vague. When the merchant prepared to leave, Benjamin returned the watch as instructed. Then, after a pause that held no drama, he asked if he might borrow it for a short time. The request was unusual. The merchant refused at first. Benjamin did not argue. He explained his intent plainly. He would examine it, learn from it, and return it unchanged. The merchant agreed with conditions. The watch would be returned intact. Any damage would be paid for. The terms were clear. When the merchant departed, the watch remained. This was the line. Benjamin did not announce his intention. He did not seek approval. He waited until the house was quiet, until the work of the day had ended. Then he began. He dismantled the watch piece by piece, not quickly, not recklessly. Each component was removed, examined, and set aside. He observed how motion transferred from one part to another. He noted proportions. He traced paths. He did not rely on memory alone. He recorded what he could on scraps of paper. The act itself violated no law, yet it crossed an unspoken boundary. Knowledge of such mechanisms was not forbidden, but it was guarded. The watch represented a craft passed through apprenticeship and protected by tradition. For a man in Benjamin's position to claim access without permission was to challenge order. He worked through the night. He did not eat. He did not rest. When daylight returned, the watch lay disassembled before him. He understood it in a way he had never understood anything before. Then he reversed the process. He reassembled the watch exactly as it had been. He tested it. It ticked. It kept time. When the merchant returned, Benjamin placed the watch in his hand without comment. The merchant examined it closely. He found no fault. The transaction ended without acknowledgement of what had occurred. But something irreversible had taken place. Benjamin had crossed from observation into creation. He had proven to himself that understanding was not confined to permission. The system that restricted him remained intact, but its intellectual authority had been breached. This realization did not bring relief. It brought burden. From that point forward, Benjamin could not return to passive curiosity. The pressure that had compressed his attention now demanded release. He knew what he was capable of learning. He knew what had been denied him. The injustice was no longer abstract. It had form. He did not speak of the watch. He did not share what he had learned. He returned to his routines outwardly unchanged, but the silence he carried was heavier now, charged with intent. The line had been crossed, and there would be no retreat. Benjamin did not announce a change in direction. Nothing in his daily conduct suggested that anything new had begun. He continued to rise before daylight. He worked the land with the same measured pace. He spoke little and listened much. To any observer, his life remained fixed within its old boundaries. The resistance took place where no one looked. He began to keep records, though he would not have used that word. He wrote not to persuade and not to preserve a public account, but to steady his own understanding. Paper was scarce, so he wrote small. Margins were filled. Lines overlapped. Calculations shared space with whether notes and fragments of scripture. Nothing was orderly enough to attract attention. He returned again and again to the memory of the watch, not its appearance but its structure. He recreated it in his mind until he no longer needed reference. He drew variations. He tested proportions using wood scraps from the farm. Pieces that failed were burned or reused. Nothing was wasted. This work took place at night and during seasons when field labor eased slightly. It did not replace his obligations. It followed them. Fatigue was constant. He learned to work through it without complaint. Rest, when it came, was shallow. The clock, he imagined, was not an act of defiance in his mind. It was an answer to a question he could not put aside. Could order be built from understanding alone? Could precision exist without patronage? Could knowledge be made durable in a world designed to deny its source? He carved slowly. Wood behaved differently than metal. It warped, split, resisted fine tolerance. He learned its limits through failure. Gears had to be redesigned, ratios recalculated, weight adjusted. Time passed without visible progress. No one assisted him. No one supervised him. No one corrected him. This isolation was both obstacle and protection. There were no witnesses to doubt or interfere. There were also no guides. He measured time by observation while attempting to contain it mechanically. The contradiction did not trouble him. It sharpened him. Occasionally, neighbors noticed unusual objects near his workspace. They did not ask questions. He did not offer explanation. Curiosity, when left unsatisfied, tended to fade. This was his resistance. Not refusal, not protest, not speech, persistence. He documented what he could not yet complete. He noted where his reasoning failed. He returned to those points later, sometimes weeks after setting them aside. Memory, sharpened by necessity, served him well. He did not rely on hope. He relied on repetition. The injustice he resisted was not only the system around him, but the expectation of limitation within it. Every completed component contradicted an assumption that had never been spoken aloud but was always present. When doubt arose, it did not take the form of fear. It took the form of silence. He asked himself whether the work mattered, whether it would change anything. These questions had no answers. He worked anyway. The clock began to take shape over time, not as a single object, but as a collection of resolved problems. Each solution made the next possible. Progress was uneven. Months passed without visible advancement. Then a single adjustment clarified several others. Benjamin did not celebrate these moments. He recorded them and moved on. This quiet resistance did not alter his standing in the county. It did not shield him from scrutiny or soften the pressure that continued to build around him. Patrols still passed. Laws still tightened. The injustice remained intact. But within the narrow space allowed to him, Benjamin had begun to construct something the system could not account for. Not yet visible, not yet known, but real. He continued, knowing only that stopping would mean surrender to the limits imposed upon him. When the clock finally stood upright in the corner of the main room, it did not announce itself. It occupied space without ceremony. Its case was plain, its face unadorned. Nothing about it invited admiration. It existed as a tool, not a statement. Benjamin did not display it. He did not call neighbors to see it. He allowed it to run, listening for error. Days passed, then weeks. The mechanism held. The striking followed the hour without drift. Time, which had always been approximate on the farm, took on definition. Word traveled anyway. It always did. Someone heard the striking at a distance. Someone mentioned it in passing. Curiosity followed without intent. A neighbor asked whether the sound came from a purchased clock. Benjamin answered truthfully. The neighbor asked where it had been obtained. Benjamin answered truthfully again. The response was not disbelief, it was dismissal. The explanation did not fit within accepted boundaries, so it was set aside. The neighbor nodded once and changed the subject. That should have ended the matter. Instead, it began to move quietly outward. People came, not in groups, not with enthusiasm. One at a time. They stood in the doorway or just inside the room. They listened. They examined the clock with care that bordered on suspicion. Some asked questions, most did not. No one accused Benjamin openly. No one praised him either. The reactions fell into a narrow range between unease and correction. Suggestions were offered. Perhaps someone else had built it. Perhaps parts had been purchased. Perhaps the mechanism was simpler than it appeared. Benjamin did not argue. He answered only what was asked. He did not defend the work. He allowed it to stand on its own. This refusal to explain unsettled some visitors more than any claim might have. Explanation would have allowed dismissal. Silence required confrontation with fact. The local authorities did not come immediately. Institutions rarely moved quickly unless threatened. The clock did not threaten order directly, it threatened assumption. That took longer to register. When attention did arrive, it came indirectly. A magistrate mentioned the matter to a landowner. A landowner mentioned it to another. The conversation remained informal, framed as curiosity rather than concern, but the questions sharpened. Could such a thing be possible? Had it been examined properly? Was it accurate? Could it truly have been made without outside assistance? Benjamin was not summoned, he was observed. One afternoon, a man known for surveying land in the county stopped by. He asked to see the clock. He examined it closely. He asked technical questions. Benjamin answered them precisely. The man listened without comment. When he left, he offered no judgment. Weeks passed. The pressure did not escalate, but it did not recede. The clock continued to strike the hours. Its reliability became difficult to ignore. The denial took form not as prohibition, but as containment. The story was allowed to circulate with qualifications attached. The maker was described as clever with his hands, not as knowledgeable. The work was framed as imitation rather than understanding. The achievement was reduced to novelty. This language mattered. It allowed the institution to absorb contradiction without changing structure. If Benjamin's work could be categorized as anomaly, it did not require revision of belief. Benjamin became aware of this framing through repetition. Phrases returned altered but consistent. He was described as remarkable for his kind. The clock was described as surprising, not instructive. Admiration, where it appeared, was carefully limited. He did not respond. Resistance through correction would have drawn the institution into open conflict. He had no interest in that. His resistance remained quiet. The denial extended beyond the clock. When Benjamin offered assistance with calculations or measurements thereafter, his involvement was constrained. He was asked to verify results, not to originate them. His input was accepted only when it confirmed existing conclusions. This pattern clarified the nature of the institution he faced. It did not deny evidence outright. It reinterpreted it until it posed no threat. Benjamin understood this without bitterness. He had learned long before that systems preserved themselves. The clock had revealed that truth as clearly as it measured time. He continued his work. He observed the sky. He recorded changes. He refined his calculations. He did not seek recognition. He sought accuracy. The institution denied him acknowledgement, but it could not prevent him from knowing what he knew. That knowledge, once secured, could not be taken. The pressure remained. The injustice persisted, but the quiet resistance had survived its first encounter with authority. The clock kept time. Truth did not surface through announcement or confession. It emerged gradually, carried by necessity rather than intent. The clock continued to function year after year. Its constancy became its argument. Time, measured accurately and without interruption, did not allow speculation to endure indefinitely. Visitors returned, sometimes after long absence, and found the mechanism unchanged. The striking did not drift. The movement did not falter. Wood, assumed to be an inadequate medium, held its form. Those who had dismissed the clock as novelty found themselves repeating the same explanations for too long. Novelty fades. This did not. Benjamin did not exploit this persistence. He did not use it to press claims or demand acknowledgement. He allowed others to reach conclusions at their own pace, knowing that truth forced too quickly often hardened resistance rather than dissolving it. The wider world reached him late and indirectly. A family of Quakers settled along the Patapsco River, drawn by water power and the promise of industry. They brought with them books, instruments, and habits that differed from those common in the county. Their manner was plain, their speech measured. They did not hold slaves. They did not speak loudly of this difference, but it was known. One of them heard of the clock. When George Ellicott came to see it, he did not arrive as a skeptic seeking contradiction. He arrived as a man accustomed to examining mechanisms without fear of what he might find. He asked permission before entering. He listened before speaking. Benjamin answered his questions without hesitation and without display. The exchange differed from those that had come before. Ellicott did not reduce the work to imitation. He asked how it functioned. He asked why certain choices had been made. He followed explanations rather than redirecting them. For the first time, Benjamin encountered acknowledgement that did not carry qualification. Ellicott returned. He brought books. He brought tables. He brought instruments unfamiliar to the farm. He did not present them as gifts. He presented them as tools to be shared. The distinction mattered. Through this exchange, the truth of Benjamin's ability extended beyond the clock. Astronomy required calculation of a different order, one that left little room for interpretation. Numbers either aligned with observation or they did not. Precision could be checked. Error could be demonstrated. Benjamin worked through the material methodically. He did not rush to application. He studied first. He tested his understanding against the sky. The work was slow and demanding. Calculations were performed by hand, often repeated to ensure accuracy. Mistakes were corrected without frustration. When Benjamin predicted eclipses with precision that matched established tables, the results could not be framed as novelty. They required explanation. They required acknowledgement of method. Ellicott shared these findings carefully, not as proclamation but as evidence. He showed others the calculations. He allowed them to verify the results independently. This approach denied denial its usual refuge. Truth surfaced not because it was asserted, but because it endured examination. Still, resistance did not vanish. It shifted. Some accepted the evidence reluctantly. Others accepted it in part. A few dismissed it entirely. Institutions rarely move as one body. They fracture, adjust, and delay. Yet the record had begun. Benjamin's work entered correspondence. His name appeared in letters exchanged between men accustomed to measuring credibility by rigor rather than lineage. The truth of his ability no longer depended solely on local reputation. It existed in numbers that could be checked anywhere. This expansion did not alter his daily life. He remained on the farm. He continued his routines. Fame, where it existed, arrived as paper and ink rather than visitors. Recognition did not translate into security. But something had changed. The truth no longer relied on survival within one county. It had been carried outward, where institutional denial could not contain it so easily. Benjamin did not celebrate this shift. He treated it as continuation rather than arrival. The injustice he lived within remained intact. Enslavement continued. Laws remained unchanged. His work did not dismantle the system that constrained him. It did something quieter. It removed the excuse. Those who continued to deny the capacity of black men to reason could no longer claim absence of evidence. They could only claim refusal to accept it. The distinction mattered, even if its consequences unfolded slowly. Truth had surfaced not as triumph but as record. The final years did not resolve the contradiction that had shaped Benjamin's life. They clarified it. Recognition arrived unevenly and late. It did not bring protection. It did not alter the laws that governed his movement or secure his property against challenge. The institutions that had denied him at first adjusted only enough to absorb his example without dismantling their assumptions. Benjamin returned always to the farm. The land remained his responsibility and his burden. Portions of it were sold as necessity required. Each sale reduced the physical space of his life but preserved its continuity. He lived without extravagance, without complaint. His needs were few. His work remained steady. The correspondence continued for a time. Almanacs were produced. Calculations were published. His name appeared in print, sometimes with respect, sometimes with caution. His letter to Thomas Jefferson circulated, paired with a reply that acknowledged evidence without surrendering belief. The contradiction endured at the highest level of the nation. Benjamin did not respond publicly to Jefferson's private doubts. He understood their purpose. To argue further would not change the nature of the exchange. He had provided proof. What others chose to do with it lay beyond his control. Age narrowed his days. His eyesight weakened. Long hours of observation took their toll. He adapted as he always had, adjusting method rather than abandoning work. When calculation became difficult, he slowed. When observation failed, he relied on record. He did not leave a diary of feeling. What remains is functional. Lists, tables, notes. The absence of reflection is itself a record. It suggests a man who measured value by accuracy rather than expression. When he died, it was without ceremony. He had walked earlier that day. He lay down and did not rise. The record does not describe pain or struggle. It notes only the fact. The fire came soon after. It destroyed the house and everything within it. The clock that had marked time faithfully for decades collapsed. Instruments were lost. Papers burned. Whether the fire was accident or intent remains unknown. The result was the same. Physical evidence vanished. What remained existed elsewhere. Almanacs printed and distributed, letters preserved by recipients, testimony recorded by those who had examined his work. The truth had already moved beyond the structure that burned. The aftermath unfolded slowly, as most consequences do. Abolitionists cited his work. Others dismissed it. His name surfaced and receded. Memory persisted unevenly. Benjamin did not live to see the end of slavery. He did not live to see the institutions he challenged dismantled. He lived within them and left them largely intact. His achievement lay not in transformation, but in documentation. He demonstrated what could be done under constraint. He created a record that could not be reconciled with the lie that sustained injustice. He did not defeat the system. He weakened its foundation. The aftermath of his life was not celebration. It was persistence. His example remained available to those who needed it. It waited, as truth often does, for conditions to change enough to be heard. The clock no longer struck the hour, but the measure it had introduced endured.